The thunder cracked like a pistol shot across the dusty plains of Montana Territory, as Violet Kane huddled under the sparse shelter of a lightning-struck cottonwood tree, her trembling fingers clutching what remained of her torn dress. The year was 1877, and at 22 years old, she was now entirely alone in the world, miles from civilization with night falling fast and the spring storm bearing down with merciless fury. She'd lost everything her family to illness 3 months prior, her meager savings to the thieves who'd robbed the stagecoach 2 days ago, and now even her dignity after fleeing the unwanted advances of the station master at the last outpost. The rain began to fall in earnest, cold drops mingling with the tears on her dirt-streaked face as she considered her grim prospects. A horse's whinny pierced the storm's cacophony, followed by the distinctive creak of saddle leather. Violet shrank back against the tree trunk, heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The approaching rider emerged from the gloom tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette unmistakably that of a cowboy, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the driving rain. "Hello there," he called, voice carrying over the wind. "You hurt, madam?" She remained silent, weighing her limited options. The stranger dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle, approaching slowly with his palms visible, as one might approach a spooked horse. "I mean no harm," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. Lightning flashed, illuminating a face weathered by sun and wind but with kind eyes that held no threat. "Name's Brody Keller. I've got a cabin about 3 miles east of here. Storm's only getting worse." Violet's teeth chattered as another gust of frigid wind cut through her sodden clothes. "How do I know I can trust you?" she managed, her voice barely audible above the rain. He unhooked the heavy canvas duster from his saddle and held it out. "You don't. But you'll catch your death out here tonight for certain." After a long moment, desperation won out over caution. She stepped forward, accepting the coat with trembling hands. It enveloped her completely, still warm from his body. "Don't leave me alone tonight," she cried suddenly, surprising even herself with the naked fear in her voice. The cowboy's expression softened. He wrapped the coat more securely around her shoulders, his calloused fingers gentle against the material. "I promise," he said simply, as if offering far more than just shelter from a storm. "You won't be alone." In that moment, with rain streaming down his face and thunder rolling across the plains, Brody Keller made a vow he had no business making to a woman whose name he didn't even know. But there was something in her eyes, a wounded dignity, a fierce will to survive that stirred something long dormant within him. "I'm Violet," she offered, clutching the coat around her like armor. "Violet Kane." "Miss Kane," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Let's get you somewhere dry." He helped her onto his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, before swinging up behind her. Violet stiffened momentarily at the proximity, but the solid warmth of him at her back was undeniably comforting against the storm's assault. They rode in silence, the horse picking its way carefully through the gathering darkness. Violet was acutely aware of the stranger's arm around her waist, steadying her, and the steady rhythm of his breathing against her back. She had no idea if she was riding toward safety or further peril, but the alternative, remaining alone in the storm, had been no choice at all. The cabin appeared like a mirage through the curtain of rain, small but solidly built, with a thin line of smoke still rising from the stone chimney. Brody dismounted first, then reached up to help her down, his strong hand spanning her waist with care. "It's not much," he said, leading the horse to a small lean-to stable attached to the cabin. "But it's dry and warm." Violet stood uncertainly in the doorway as he quickly tended to his mount, removing the saddle and rubbing the animal down with practiced efficiency. When he finally joined her, rainwater running in rivulets from his hat, she was shivering uncontrollably despite the heavy coat. The cabin's interior was spare but neat, a single room with a stone fireplace, A narrow bed in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding provisions and a few books. Brody immediately stoked the banked fire, adding logs until flames leaped up the chimney. "You need dry clothes," he said matter-of-factly, turning to a wooden trunk. He pulled out a flannel shirt and wool trousers. "They'll be too big, but they're clean. I'll step outside while you change." "No," Violet said quickly, the prospect of being alone again suddenly terrifying. "Just turn around, please." He nodded, moving to face the wall with his back to her. Violet shed the wet dress as quickly as her numb fingers would allow, pulling on the offered clothing with desperate haste. The shirt reached nearly to her knees, the sleeves hanging well past her fingertips. "I'm decent," she said, her voice small in the cabin's confines. Brody turned, his expression unreadable as he took in her appearance. He gestured toward the fireplace. "Sit. I'll make coffee." Violet sank down on a bearskin rug before the fire, drawing her knees to her chest. She watched as he moved efficiently around the small space, setting a pot of water to boil on the cast iron stove in the corner. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his deep voice unexpectedly gentle. Only then did she realize she hadn't eaten since the previous day. "Yes," she admitted. "Very." He nodded, retrieving dried venison and hardtack from a shelf. "It's simple fare, but filling." "Thank you," she whispered, the full impact of her situation finally hitting her. Tears welled up and spilled over before she could stop them. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Brody knelt before her, offering a surprisingly clean handkerchief. "No need to apologize, Miss Kane. Montana Territory's no place for anyone to be alone in a storm." He hesitated, then asked, "If you don't mind my asking, what were you doing out there?" Violet dabbed at her eyes, gathering her composure. "The stagecoach I was on was robbed 2 days ago near Fort Benton. The driver was killed. The other passengers and I walked to the nearest station, but the station master there." She trailed off, unwilling to give voice to what had nearly happened. Brody's jaw tightened, understanding darkening his eyes. "So you ran?" She nodded, staring into the flames. "I was heading to Billings. My aunt lives there, or at least she did 10 years ago when she last wrote to my father." "That's nearly 100 miles from here," he said, concern evident in his voice. "I know," Violet whispered. "I thought I could make it to the next station before nightfall." The coffee began to boil and Brody rose to pour 2 tin cups. He handed one to Violet along with a piece of jerky and hardtack. They ate in silence, the storm raging outside making the cabin's warmth feel all the more precious. "You can take the bed," Brody said finally. "I'll sleep by the fire." Violet looked up sharply. "I've imposed enough. I can't take your bed." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "My mother would haunt me till my dying day if I let a lady sleep on the floor." The mention of his mother sparked Violet's curiosity. "Do you live here alone?" "Yes," he said simply. "For the past 5 years. No wife, family, no wife." He stared into his coffee cup. "My parents had a small ranch south of here. Fever took them both the winter of '72. I worked cattle drives for a few years after, then saved enough to buy this place." "I'm sorry about your parents," Violet said softly. "Mine are gone too, this past winter." Their eyes met across the firelight, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. "Get some rest, Miss Kane," Brody said gently. "Tomorrow we can figure out how to get you safely to Billings." Violet nodded, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. She moved to the narrow bed, sinking down onto the surprisingly comfortable mattress. "Mr. Keller," he looked up from where he was spreading a blanket near the hearth. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, a gesture somehow more eloquent than words, and Violet turned to face the wall, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Despite her fears and the strange surroundings, the rhythmic sound of the rain on the roof and the quiet presence of her unexpected protector lulled her into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. She woke to the scent of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. Dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window, revealing Brody at the stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a cast iron skillet. Violet sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Brody turned, nodding a greeting. "Hope you're hungry. Got some flapjacks and the last of my bacon." Her stomach rumbled in response, and a fleeting smile crossed his face, the first she'd seen. It transformed his features, softening the hard angles and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "The storm's passed," he said, setting 2 plates on the table. "But the creek between here and the main trail will be flooded for at least a day. We're stuck here until it recedes." Violet joined him at the table, suddenly aware of how intimate the small cabin felt in the morning light. Brody Keller was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 29, with dark brown hair and eyes the color of whiskey. A scar ran along his jaw, disappearing into the stubble that shadowed his face. "I don't want to keep you from your work," she said, cutting into the perfectly browned flapjack. "Nothing that can't wait," he replied with a shrug. "I was planning to ride into town for supplies anyway." "That'll just have to wait until the creek's passable." They ate in companionable silence, and Violet found herself studying her host with growing curiosity. There was a quiet strength about him, an integrity that she sensed instinctively. Despite her precarious situation, she felt safer than she had in months. "Your cooking puts mine to shame," she admitted, finishing the last bite. "When you live alone, you learn quick or you eat poorly," he said simply. "Coffee," she nodded, watching as he refilled her cup. "Mr. Keller, Brody," he corrected. "Mr. Keller was my father, Brody," she amended. "I need to thank you properly for your kindness. Not many men would have stopped to help a stranger, especially in such conditions." He looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Any decent man would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," Violet said quietly. "Especially out here." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition of the harsh realities they both understood all too well. The Montana Territory was beautiful but unforgiving, and human decency was sometimes as scarce as water in the high plains summer. "Your dress should be dry," he said, changing the subject. "I hung it by the fire last night." Violet glanced at the simple calico garment. It was dry but still bore the tears and dirt from her flight. "I'm afraid it's seen better days." "I might have something that could help," Brody said, rising from the table. He rummaged in a wooden chest, eventually producing a faded blue dress. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice carefully neutral. "Never could bring myself to get rid of it." Violet took the offered garment with reverent hands. It was a simple prairie dress, well made and only slightly outdated. "Are you sure? This is a treasured memory." "She'd want it used," he said simply. "Besides, it's doing no good sitting in that chest." "Thank you," Violet said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "I'll take good care of it." Brody nodded, then collected the plates. "I need to check on the livestock. Take your time." After he'd gone, Violet changed quickly into the blue dress. It fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the waist. She found a comb on a shelf and did her best to tame her auburn hair, wishing fleetingly for a mirror. When Brody returned, he paused momentarily in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in her appearance. "It suits you," he said finally, looking away quickly. "The dress." Violet felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you for lending it to me." He cleared his throat. "Creek's still running high. We'll be here another day at least." "I hope I'm not imposing too greatly," she said, smoothing the fabric of the dress nervously. "No imposition," he assured her, "but I should warn you I've got nothing much to offer in the way of entertainment." Violet glanced at the small shelf of books. "You read?" A faint color touched his cheekbones. "When time allows." She crossed to examine the titles: a well-worn Bible, several dime novels, a battered copy of Shakespeare's collected works, and surprisingly, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Violet couldn't help but smile as she picked up the last volume. Jane Austen. Somehow I wouldn't have guessed. Brody rubbed the back of his neck, looking slightly embarrassed. My mother's. She used to read passages aloud in the evenings. It's one of my favorites, Violet admitted. My father was a schoolteacher before we came west. He believed girls should be educated just as thoroughly as boys. A progressive man, Brody commented, something like approval in his tone. Yes, Violet agreed, memories of her father bringing a bittersweet ache to her chest. He was. Perhaps sensing her sadness, Brody moved toward the door. I need to repair some fencing that came down in the storm. Will you be all right here? Of course, she said quickly. Is there anything I can do to help around the cabin? He seemed about to refuse, then reconsidered. If you're of a mind to, there's flour and such on the shelf. I wouldn't say no to fresh bread. Violet smiled, grateful for the opportunity to be useful. Consider it done. After Brody left, Violet set about exploring the cabin's modest provisions. She found flour, salt, and a small crock of lard enough to make a decent loaf of bread. The physical activity of kneading dough was soothing, giving her time to reflect on her situation. By all logic, she should be terrified alone in a remote cabin with a man she'd just met. Yet she felt an inexplicable sense of safety in Brody Keller's presence. There was a fundamental decency about him that couldn't be feigned. The cabin door opened as she was sliding the loaf into the oven, admitting a gust of cool air and Brody, his arms laden with firewood. "Smells promising," he commented, stacking the wood neatly beside the hearth. "It's the least I can do," Violet replied, wiping flour from her hands. "Though I should warn you, my bread is serviceable but not spectacular." "Hot bread of any quality beats hardtack," he said, the corner of his mouth quirking upward. They fell into an easy routine as the day progressed. Brody worked outside, coming in occasionally to warm up or check on her. Violet tended to the bread, then set about tidying the already neat cabin, finding unexpected contentment in the simple domestic tasks. By late afternoon, they shared fresh bread with the last of Brody's preserved peaches, sitting at the small table as rain began to fall again, gentler this time, a soft patter against the roof. "Tell me about Billings," Brody said, breaking a comfortable silence. "What awaits you there besides your aunt?" Violet traced a pattern on the wooden tabletop with her finger. "I'm not entirely sure my aunt is still there," she admitted, "but it's the only direction I have. After my parents died, there was nothing left for me in Minnesota. The farm was mortgaged, and after the debts were paid, I had just enough for the journey west. And now even that's gone," Brody observed quietly. "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze squarely, "but I'm still determined to reach Billings. I have skills I can teach or keep accounts. I'll find my way." Brody studied her thoughtfully. "I believe you will, Miss Kane." "Violet," she corrected with a small smile. "If I'm to call you Brody, then you should use my given name." "Violet," he repeated, and she was struck by how her name seemed to take on a different quality when spoken in his deep voice. They lapsed into silence again, but it was a comfortable one, filled with the ambient sounds of the rain and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Violet couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at peace. As evening approached, Brody lit the oil lamps, casting the cabin in a warm glow. He rummaged in a cupboard and produced a deck of cards. "Poker," he suggested. Violet's eyes sparkled with unexpected mischief. "Only if you're prepared to lose, Mr. Keller." His eyebrows rose in surprise. "Is that so?" "My father believed card games improved mathematical thinking," she explained with a hint of pride. "I've been playing since I was 12. A genuine smile spread across Brody's face. "Well then, Miss Kane, I believe I've been warned." They played for matches instead of money, and Violet proved her claim was no idle boast. Her quick mind calculated odds with remarkable accuracy, and her face betrayed nothing of her hand. By the time they called it a night, she had accumulated a small mountain of matches. "I should have known better than to underestimate a schoolteacher's daughter," Brody conceded with good humor as they put the cards away. "It's a common mistake," Violet replied, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. Then, more seriously, "Thank you for today, for making me feel welcome rather than a burden." Brody's expression softened. "You're not a burden, Violet." The way he said her name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. They stood facing each other in the lamplight, and for a breathless moment, Violet thought he might step closer. Instead, he cleared his throat and moved toward his makeshift bed by the fire. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice slightly rough. "The creek might be passable tomorrow if the rain stops." Violet nodded, ignoring the faint disappointment that whispered through her. "Good night, Brody." "Good night, Violet." She lay awake longer than she should have, listening to the rain and the occasional shift of Brody's weight on the floor. Her thoughts were a confusing jumble: gratitude for his kindness, anxiety about her uncertain future, and beneath it all, a growing awareness of the man himself. His quiet strength, his evident integrity, the gentle way he spoke her name, all of it was affecting her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was foolish, she told herself firmly. In a day or two, she would continue on to Billings, and Brody Keller would become a brief, if significant, memory. Nothing more could come of their chance meeting. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, Violet couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to belong somewhere again to someone as the storm raged outside and the fire burned low in the hearth. Morning brought clearing skies and the promise of a break in the weather. Violet woke to find Brody already gone, the cabin quiet save for the distant sound of an axe striking wood. She dressed quickly in her borrowed blue dress and set about making a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with the last of the bacon. Brody returned as she was setting the table, his shirt damp with exertion despite the cool morning air. He paused in the doorway, something like surprise flickering across his face at the domestic scene awaiting him. "You didn't have to cook," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I wanted to," Violet replied simply. "It's ready whenever you are." He washed up at the basin by the door, and they sat down to eat together as golden sunlight streamed through the window. "The creek's going down," Brody reported between bites. "Should be passable by tomorrow morning." Violet nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang the news brought. "That's good," she said, keeping her tone light. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It's been no imposition," Brody said quietly. Their eyes met briefly across the table, and Violet was the first to look away, suddenly flustered by the intensity in his gaze. "What will you do today?" she asked, changing the subject. "Need to check the fence lines to the north," he replied. "Make sure none of my cattle wandered off during the storm." Would it be possible for me to come with you?" Violet asked impulsively. "I've been cooped up for days, first on the stagecoach, then here. Some fresh air would be welcome." Brody seemed surprised by the request but nodded. "It's not an easy ride, about 4 miles each way." "I can manage," she assured him. "I grew up on a farm, remember? I'm no stranger to horses." "All right then," he agreed, a hint of respect in his tone. "We'll leave in half an hour." Brody provided her with a spare pair of leather gloves and helped her mount a gentle sorrel mare he called Penny. Violet gathered the reins competently, adjusting her seat in the saddle with practiced ease. "You weren't exaggerating about knowing horses," Brody commented, swinging up onto his buckskin. "My father believed girls should know how to ride astride, not just side saddle," Violet explained. "Mother never quite approved, but she tolerated it." They set off at an easy pace, the morning sun warming their backs as they rode. The storm had left the landscape fresh, washed, and vibrant, wildflowers dotting the rolling grassland in splashes of color. After the confinement of the cabin, the vast openness of the Montana plains was exhilarating. Brody was a quiet companion, but not uncomfortably so. He pointed out landmarks as they rode a distinctive rock formation to the west, the distant smudge of mountains to the north, a hawk circling lazily overhead. Violet drank in the details, storing them away like treasures. They stopped to repair a section of fence that had partially collapsed, working side by side in comfortable silence. Violet held the post steady while Brody secured the wire, her capable assistants earning a nod of approval. "You're handy to have around," he commented as they remounted. "High praise indeed," she replied with a smile. They continued their circuit, stopping occasionally to check on cattle or mend another fence section. By midday, they'd reached a high ridge overlooking a sweeping valley, the land below them a patchwork of green grassland and darker stands of pine. "It's beautiful," Violet breathed, taking in the panorama. "This is my favorite spot on the property," Brody admitted, dismounting and loosening his horse's cinch to give the animal a rest. "You can see for 20 miles on a clear day like this." Violet slid from her saddle, stretching her legs gratefully. Despite her earlier confidence, it had been some time since she'd ridden for hours, and she could feel it in her muscles. They shared a simple lunch of jerky and biscuits left over from breakfast, sitting on sun-warmed rocks with the magnificent view spread before them. "How large is your ranch?" Violet asked, curious about the extent of his holdings. "About 2,000 acres, Brody replied. "Small by Montana standards, but enough for me. I run about 100 head of cattle, nothing fancy, but they're good stock." "You manage all this alone," he nodded. "Hire extra hands during calving season and for the occasional cattle drive, but day to day, it's just me." "It must get lonely," Violet observed softly. Brody was quiet for a long moment. "I've gotten used to it," he said finally. "After my parents died, I didn't much feel like company anyway." "I understand that," Violet said, thinking of her own grief. "After my parents passed, I couldn't bear the sympathetic looks, the well-meaning visitors bringing food and platitudes." "Folks mean well," Brody acknowledged, "but sometimes their comfort feels like sandpaper on an open wound." "Yes," Violet agreed, surprised and touched by his perfect articulation of what she'd felt. "Exactly like that." They fell silent, united in the shared experience of loss. A meadowlark called from a nearby bush, its clear, liquid notes spilling across the quiet. "We should head back," Brody said eventually, getting to his feet. "Still have the southern section to check, and daylight won't last forever." They completed their circuit by mid-afternoon, the horses picking up their pace as they neared home. Violet found herself thinking of the cabin as home, if only temporarily, and the realization startled her. 2 days under Brody Keller's roof, and already the place had worked its way into her consciousness. As they approached the cabin, Violet noticed fresh tracks in the muddy path. A wagon had been there recently. "Were you expecting visitors?" she asked, suddenly alert. Brody frowned, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "No." They approached cautiously, but the area around the cabin was deserted. On the porch sat a wooden crate with a note nailed to the top. "It's from Tom Jenkins," Brody said, reading the note with evident relief. "Storekeeper from town. Says he was passing by on his way back from a delivery and dropped off the supplies I ordered last week." "That was fortunate timing," Violet observed as they dismounted. "Very," Brody agreed, lifting the heavy crate with ease. "Especially since there's coffee in here. We were down to the dregs." They tended to the horses together, removing saddles and brushing them down before turning them into the small corral. Violet enjoyed the simple chores, finding satisfaction in the physical work after days of uncertainty and fear. Inside, they unpacked the supplies: coffee, flour, sugar, beans, bacon, and a few modest luxuries like a tin of peaches and a small pouch of peppermint candies. "Supper's my turn," Brody insisted when Violet began reaching for the cooking pots. "You rest." It's been a long ride for someone not used to the saddle. She didn't argue, grateful for the chance to ease her aching muscles. Settling into the chair by the fire, Violet watched as Brody moved about the kitchen area with surprising grace for such a large man. There was something deeply appealing about his self-sufficiency, his quiet competence in all things. "You're staring," he observed without looking up from the beans he was preparing. Violet felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I was just thinking that you manage remarkably well on your own." "Necessity is a good teacher," he replied with a shrug. "Although I won't pretend I wouldn't welcome a woman's touch around the place sometimes." The comment hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Violet looked down at her hands, uncertain how to respond. "I'm sorry," Brody said after a moment. "That was presumptuous." "No," Violet said quickly. "It's a natural thing to want companionship. I feel the same way, especially since losing my parents. The silence can be overwhelming at times." Brody nodded, his expression thoughtful as he continued preparing their meal. By the time they sat down to eat, the momentary awkwardness had passed, replaced by the easy companionship they'd established during the day's ride. After supper, instead of cards, Brody reached for Pride and Prejudice from the shelf. "Would you read some?" he asked, holding the book out to her. "It's been years since I heard it properly." Touched by the request, Violet took the well-worn volume and began to read, her clear voice bringing Jane Austen's words to life in the quiet cabin. Brody listened intently, occasionally smiling at a particularly witty passage. When her voice began to tire, he took the book from her hands, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. "My turn," he said, opening to where she'd left off. Violet was surprised by the richness of his reading voice, the way he gave each character a distinctive tone without being theatrical. She found herself drawn into the story anew, seeing it through fresh eyes. They passed the evening this way, trading chapters until the fire burned low and Violet had to stifle a yawn. "We should sleep," Brody said, marking their place in the book with a scrap of leather. "Tomorrow will come early enough." Violet nodded, suddenly melancholy at the thought that tomorrow would likely be their last day together. "Thank you for today," she said softly, "for sharing your land, your home, all of it." Brody's gaze held hers for a long moment. "You're welcome here, Violet. Remember that." The simple statement carried weight far beyond its words, and Violet felt it settle around her heart like a promise. "Good night, Brody." "Good night, Violet." She lay awake longer than she should have, listening to the night sounds of the cabin, the occasional pop from the dying fire, the soft creaks of the structure settling, Brody's deep, even breathing from his place on the floor. Tomorrow she would continue her journey to Billings, to an aunt who might not even remember her, to an uncertain future in a town where she knew no one. The thought brought none of the determination she'd felt just days ago. Instead, a hollow feeling spread through her chest at the prospect of leaving this cabin, this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "It's foolish," she told herself firmly. "You barely know him." Yet somehow, in the space of just a few days, Brody Keller had come to represent safety and comfort in a way no one had since her parents' deaths. The thought of riding away from him left her cold despite the warmth of the quilt around her. Morning came too quickly, pale light filtering through the cabin window as Violet opened her eyes. She lay still for a moment, listening, but heard no movement in the cabin. Sitting up, she saw that Brody's bedroll was empty, already neatly stowed against the wall. She dressed quickly in the blue dress, running fingers through her hair in a futile attempt to tame it. Outside, she found Brody by the corral, saddling both horses. "Good morning," she called, approaching him with a forced brightness that didn't match the heaviness in her chest. He straightened, turning to face her. "Morning," he replied, his expression unreadable. "Creek's down. Trail should be clear all the way to the stage road." "That's good news," Violet said, the words tasting false on her tongue. Brody nodded, returning his attention to the saddle's cinch. "I've packed some provisions for your journey. Should last you to Billings if you're careful." "Thank you," she said, touched by his thoughtfulness even as disappointment settled in her stomach like a stone. They ate breakfast in relative silence, the easy companionship of the previous evening replaced by a tension neither seemed willing to address. Violet washed the dishes afterward, lingering over the simple task, reluctant to signal its completion. Finally, there was nothing left to delay the inevitable. Brody helped her into her coat, her own this time, mostly dried and somewhat cleaner than when she'd arrived. "Keep the dress," he said when she began to protest that she should change back into her own clothes. "It suits you better than it ever suited that trunk." "Thank you," Violet said softly, smoothing the blue fabric with reverent hands. "For everything." They stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The horses waited patiently, Violet's borrowed mare loaded with a small bundle of supplies. Brody handed her up into the saddle, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "I'll ride with you as far as the stage road," he said, mounting his own horse. "Make sure you get there safely." They rode side by side through the morning, the landscape alive with spring's renewal. Birds called from every direction, and wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze. It was the kind of day that should inspire hope, yet Violet felt only a growing sense of loss with each mile that passed. The stage road appeared all too soon, a well-traveled dirt track cutting through the rolling grassland. They reined their horses to a stop at the junction, an awkward silence falling between them. "The westbound stage should come through by midday," Brody said, gesturing down the road. "If you follow this east about a mile, there's a way station. You can wait there." Violet nodded, her throat tight with unspoken words. "How much do I owe you for the horse? The provisions?" "Nothing," Brody said firmly. "I can't just take." "You're not taking," he interrupted. "I'm giving." "There's a difference." Violet bit her lip, blinking back sudden tears. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "No thanks needed," he said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "It was my privilege to help." They fell silent again, the moment stretching between them like a thread pulled taut. Violet knew she should say goodbye, should turn her horse toward the way station and her intended future. Instead, she found herself frozen, unable to make the final break. "I should go," she said finally, the words barely audible. "Yes," Brody agreed, though he made no move to leave. Violet gathered the reins, steeling herself for departure. "Goodbye, Brody Keller. Goodbye, Violet Kane." She turned her horse toward the east, forcing herself to move away from him. She'd gone perhaps 20 yards when his voice stopped her. "Violet." She turned in the saddle, her heart hammering against her ribs. Brody urged his horse forward until they were face to face again. "Don't go," he said simply, Violet's breath caught in her throat. "What? Stay," he said, his eyes intent on hers. "At least for a while longer. I know it's presumptuous. I know we barely know each other, but these past days—" He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "I haven't felt this way in a long time, maybe ever." Hope bloomed in Violet's chest, fragile but insistent. "What way?" "Like I'm not alone," he said softly. "Like the cabin is more than just walls and a roof when you're in it." Tears welled in Violet's eyes, but they were different from the ones she'd been fighting earlier. "I've felt it too," she admitted. "But I have nothing to offer you, Brody. No dowry, no prospects. I don't want a dowry," he interrupted. "I want you. Your smile across the breakfast table. Your voice reading by the fire. Your hands helping with the fences." He took a deep breath. "I know it's fast. I know it's not the normal way of things, but nothing about how we met was normal." Violet laughed softly through her tears. "No, it certainly wasn't." "Stay," he said again, reaching across the space between their horses to take her hand. "Not forever if you don't want to, but long enough to see if this feeling between us is real." Violet looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers small but equally work-hardened. "My aunt in Billings," she began. "We can send word," Brody assured her. "Or visit once we're sure of the address, but don't leave yet. Please." The naked vulnerability in his voice undid her completely. All the reasons she should continue to Billings' pragmatism, propriety, caution seemed insignificant compared to the certainty she felt in this moment. "All right," she said, a smile breaking through her tears. "I'll stay." The relief on Brody's face was almost comical in its intensity. "You will?" "Yes," Violet confirmed, suddenly sure. "For a while, at least, to see where this leads." Brody's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains. Without releasing her hand, he guided his horse alongside hers and leaned across the gap between them. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. Violet answered it with a softness of her own, her free hand coming up to rest against his cheek. When they broke apart, both were slightly breathless, their eyes wide with wonder at this unexpected turn of events. "We should head back," Brody said, his voice rough with emotion. "Before I forget myself completely out here in the open." Violet laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Lead the way, Mr. Keller." They turned their horses back toward the ranch, riding side by side as the morning sun climbed higher in the vast Montana sky. Violet's heart was full of a cautious joy, a sense of possibility she'd thought lost forever after her parents' deaths. She had no illusions that the path ahead would be easy. They were still near strangers in many ways, with much to learn about each other. The ranch was isolated, the work hard, the future uncertain. But for the first time since the stagecoach robbery had left her stranded and desperate, Violet felt something like hope taking root in her soul. As they crested a rise and Brody's cabin came into view in the distance, she knew with sudden clarity that she was heading home. The weeks that followed took on the quality of a dream for Violet, one filled with hard work and occasional awkwardness, but undergirded by a growing sense of rightness. She and Brody established a careful routine, learning to navigate shared spaces and differing habits with mutual respect. Propriety was maintained by Brody's insistence on continuing to sleep by the hearth, while Violet took the bed, though the arrangement became increasingly difficult as their feelings for each other deepened. Their kisses grew more frequent, more heated, but Brody always pulled away before things progressed too far, his respect for her evident even in his restraint. Spring blossomed fully around them, bringing with it the demanding work of a cattle ranch coming to life after winter. Violet threw herself into the tasks with enthusiasm, proving herself a capable partner in everything from cooking to mending fences. Her presence transformed the cabin from a mere shelter to a true home. Curtains appeared at the windows, wildflowers adorned the table, and the scent of fresh bread became a regular blessing. Word was sent to Billings about Violet's whereabouts, though no response had yet arrived. The uncertainty of her aunt's situation lingered at the edges of her consciousness. But increasingly, Violet found herself hoping that chapter of her life might remain closed. Her future, she was beginning to believe, lay here on this Montana ranch with the quiet cowboy who had saved her that stormy night. The first real test of their fledgling relationship came in late May, when Brody had to ride to Fort Benton to sell some cattle. The journey would take him away for at least a week, leaving Violet alone at the ranch. "I don't have to go," he said the night before his planned departure, watching her across the dinner table with concern. "The cattle can wait until fall." "Don't be ridiculous," Violet replied firmly. "We've been over this. The money from this sale will help us get through until the main herd is ready." Brody's expression softened at her use of us, and we words that had become natural in their conversations about the ranch and its future. "I don't like leaving you alone." "I'll be fine," she assured him, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. "I grew up on a farm, remember? I know how to handle myself." "I know you can handle yourself," he acknowledged. "That's not what worries me." "What then?" He turned his hand to clasp hers, his expression serious. "I'm afraid you'll realize how isolated this life is, how hard, that you'll decide it's not what you want after all." Violet's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. Over the past weeks, she'd come to understand that beneath Brody's quiet strength lay deep-seated fears of abandonment, born of too many losses in his young life. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "I've had plenty of time to see the challenges of ranch life. I'm still here because I want to be." He nodded, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. "I'll be back as quickly as I can." The morning of his departure arrived cool and clear. Brody loaded the last of his provisions onto the pack horses that would accompany him and the small herd of cattle. Violet stood in the doorway of the cabin, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The prospect of being alone wasn't what troubled her, it was the separation from Brody himself. In the short time they'd known each other, he had become essential to her happiness in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. "You remember how to use this?" Brody asked, checking the rifle he was leaving with her one last time. "Yes," she assured him, taking the weapon with practiced hands. "Though I doubt I'll need it. Just in case," he insisted. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles east the Hendersons. Good people. If there's any trouble, go there." Violet nodded, touched by his concern. "I'll be fine, Brody, I promise." He stepped closer, his eyes traveling over her face as if memorizing her features. "I'll be back in a week. 10 days at the most." "I'll be here," she promised. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that left her breathless. When they finally parted, his eyes were dark with emotions too complex to name. "Violet," he began, then hesitated. "Yes, I." He stopped again, seeming to wrestle with himself. "Be safe," he said finally, pressing another quick kiss to her forehead before stepping back. Violet watched as he mounted his horse and rode out with the small herd, waving until he disappeared over the rise to the north. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the loneliness that already pressed in around her. The first few days passed slowly, filled with the routine chores that kept the ranch functioning. Violet tended the vegetable garden they'd started together, milked the cow, collected eggs from the small chicken coop, and made sure the remaining livestock had water. The physical work was a blessing, keeping her hands busy even as her mind wandered frequently to Brody. On the fourth day, clouds gathered on the horizon, and by evening, rain was falling steadily. Violet sat by the fire, mending one of Brody's shirts as lightning occasionally illuminated the cabin. The storm wasn't nearly as severe as the one the night they'd met, but it stirred memories that made her smile. A sudden crash outside startled her from her reverie. Violet set aside her sewing and reached for the rifle, moving cautiously to the window. In the dim light, she could make out a section of the corral fence that had collapsed, likely struck by a falling branch. The horses were still contained, but agitated, moving restlessly in the rain. Violet hesitated only briefly before pulling on Brody's spare coat and hat. The fence couldn't wait until morning, not with the horses this unsettled. She stepped out into the downpour, rifle in hand, and made her way to the damaged corral. The repair was more difficult than she'd anticipated. The broken section was heavy, and the driving rain made the ground treacherously slick. After nearly an hour of struggling, Violet managed to brace the fence temporarily with rope and stakes, enough to keep the horses secure until proper repairs could be made in daylight. She was soaked through and shivering violently by the time she returned to the cabin. Stripping off the wet clothes, she wrapped herself in a quilt and huddled by the fire, teeth chattering as she tried to warm up. By morning, it was clear she'd caught a chill. Fever set in by midday, leaving her weak and disoriented. Violet tried to focus on the essentials keeping the fire going, forcing herself to drink water, but by the second day of illness, even these simple tasks became challenging. She lost track of time, drifting in and out of consciousness as the fever raged. In her more lucid moments, she worried about the animals, knowing they needed tending, but she couldn't summon the strength to leave the bed. It was during one such moment of clarity that she heard hoofbeats approaching. Fear spiked through her as she realized she couldn't reach the rifle leaning against the wall. Whoever was coming, she was defenseless against them. The cabin door opened, and for an instant, Violet's fever-addled brain didn't recognize the figure silhouetted against the light. Then he spoke her name, and relief washed through her like a physical wave. "Brody," she whispered, her voice cracking. He was across the room in an instant, kneeling beside the bed, his face tight with concern as he pressed a hand to her forehead. "You're burning up," he said, his voice rough with worry. "How long have you been sick?" Violet tried to focus, but the days had blurred together. "The storm," she managed. "The corral broke," understanding dawned in his eyes. "You went out in that downpour." It wasn't a question, she nodded weakly. "Had to." "Oh, Violet," he sighed, pressing a kiss to her too warm forehead. "Let me take care of you now." The next hours passed in a haze for Violet. She was vaguely aware of Brody moving about the cabin, of cool cloths on her forehead, of being helped to sip water and broth. His voice was a constant, soothing presence, though she couldn't always make out the words. When she finally woke fully, the fever broken, pale moonlight was streaming through the window. Brody was asleep in a chair pulled up beside the bed, his head at an uncomfortable angle, one hand still loosely holding hers. "Brody," she whispered, squeezing his fingers gently. He woke instantly, relief flooding his features as he leaned forward. "You're back," he said, brushing hair from her face with tender fingers. "How long?" she asked, her throat dry. 3 days since I got home," he replied, helping her sit up enough to sip from a cup of water. "You had me scared, Violet." "I'm sorry," she said, leaning into his touch. "The animals are fine," he assured her. "Everything's taken care of. The only thing that matters now is you getting better." Violet studied his face in the moonlight, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the stubble that spoke of days without shaving. "You came back early." "Something didn't feel right," Brody admitted. "I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get home." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "Thank God I listened." "My hero," Violet murmured, a small smile touching her lips despite her weakness. "No," Brody said seriously. "You're the brave one, taking on a broken corral in a thunderstorm by yourself." "Not very smart, though," she acknowledged ruefully. "Stubborn," he corrected, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on the back of her hand. "But that's one of the things I love about you." The word hung in the air between them, simple yet monumental. Brody seemed to realize what he'd said, his eyes widening slightly. "You love me," Violet whispered, hardly daring to believe she'd heard correctly. Instead of retreating, Brody's expression softened, certainty replacing surprise. "Yes," he said simply. "I love you, Violet Kane." "I think I started falling in love with you that first night, when you looked up at me with those brave eyes and asked me not to leave you alone." Tears welled in Violet's eyes. "I love you too," she confessed, the words coming easily now that they'd been invited. "I think I knew it the day we rode to the ridge together." Brody leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "I was going to wait," he said softly. "Give you more time to be sure, but seeing you like this, so ill. Life's too short and too uncertain to waste time we could have together." "What are you saying?" Violet asked, her heart racing despite her weakness. Brody drew back enough to meet her eyes. "Marry me," he said simply. "Be my wife, my partner in everything. Help me make this ranch a real home." Joy surged through Violet, giving her strength she didn't know she still possessed. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." His kiss was gentle, mindful of her still fragile state but filled with a promise that made her toes curl beneath the quilt. When they parted, the smile that illuminated his face was like nothing she'd ever seen, unguarded, radiant with happiness. "Rest now," he urged, tucking the quilt more securely around her. "We have all the time in the world to plan our future." As Violet drifted back to sleep, Brody's hand still clasping hers, she felt a peace that went beyond physical comfort. She had found her place in the world not in Billings with an aunt she barely remembered, but here on this remote Montana ranch with a man who had saved her in more ways than one. The summer of 1877 passed in a blur of happiness for Violet and Brody. Her recovery from the fever was slow but steady, with Brody proving himself a devoted, if occasionally overprotective, nurse. By the time June's warmth had fully settled over the ranch, Violet was back on her feet, throwing herself into preparations for their wedding with joyful enthusiasm. They were married on a perfect July morning, the ceremony simple but meaningful. Reverend Parker rode out from the nearest town, along with a small gathering of neighbors who had welcomed Violet warmly into their scattered community. Violet wore Brody's mother's blue dress, now altered to fit her perfectly, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Brody, freshly shaven and uncharacteristically nervous, wore his one good suit, pressed specially for the occasion. Under the vast Montana sky, with the wind rustling through the prairie grass, they exchanged vows written in their own words, promises of loyalty, partnership, and abiding love. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Brody's kiss held a new confidence, a certainty that made Violet's heart soar. The small gathering celebrated with a feast spread on tables outside the cabin: fried chicken, corn bread, fresh vegetables from Violet's thriving garden, and a wedding cake that Mrs. Henderson had insisted on baking as her gift to the couple. As twilight descended, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the soft glow of lantern light. Brody lifted Violet into his arms to carry her across the threshold of what was now truly their home together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keller," he murmured against her hair. "I've been home since the day you found me," she replied, linking her arms around his neck. That night, they discovered each other fully for the first time, their coming together as natural as breathing despite their mutual inexperience. Brody's hands, so capable with ropes and reins, proved equally adept at drawing sighs of pleasure from his new wife. Violet, in turn, amazed herself with her boldness, her willingness to explore and be explored. In the quiet aftermath, lying in each other's arms as moonlight spilled across the bed they now shared, Violet marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Brody asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the best," she replied, nestling closer against his chest. "If that stagecoach hadn't been robbed, if I hadn't had to run from that awful station master. If there hadn't been a storm that night," Brody continued, understanding exactly what she meant. "We might never have found each other," Violet finished. Brody tightened his arm around her. "I'd like to think we would have somehow. Some things are meant to be." "When did you get to be such a romantic, Mr. Keller?" she teased gently. "About the time a certain auburn-haired woman showed up half-drowned on my property," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Violet smiled against his skin, contentment washing through her like a warm tide. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she harbored no illusions about the difficulties of ranch life, they would face them together. The thought was as comforting as the solid strength of her husband's arms around her. Life settled into a new rhythm as summer gave way to fall. The ranch demanded constant attention, but the work was lighter with two pairs of hands and hearts committed to its success. Brody taught Violet to shoot properly, to ride the more spirited horses in their small remuda, to predict weather changes by the feel of the wind. Violet, in turn, expanded their garden, set up a proper dairy for making butter and cheese, and began experimenting with preserving fruits and vegetables for the winter ahead. Their evenings were precious times of companionship, reading aloud by the fire, playing cards, or simply talking about their day's work and dreams for the future. Sometimes they rode to the ridge that had become their special place, watching the sunset paint the vast Montana landscape in hues of gold and crimson. It was on one such evening in late September, as they sat side by side on their favorite outcropping of rock, that Violet gathered the courage to share news she'd been certain of for nearly 2 weeks. "Brody," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, the setting sun gilding his profile. "What is it?" Violet took his hand, placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby. Next spring." For a moment, Brody went completely still, his expression frozen between disbelief and wonder. Then, as the reality of her words sank in, his face transformed with a joy so pure it brought tears to Violet's eyes. "A baby," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Our baby." Violet nodded, her own happiness mirrored in his expression. "Are you pleased?" In answer, Brody gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "Please doesn't begin to cover it," he whispered against her hair. "Overjoyed, terrified, grateful beyond words." "I feel the same way," Violet admitted, leaning into his embrace. "It's happening faster than we planned, but it's perfect," Brody insisted, drawing back to meet her gaze. "You're perfect, and this baby will be perfect." As they rode home in the gathering dusk, Brody kept his horse close to hers, as if unwilling to let even a few feet of space come between them. His protective instincts, always strong, seemed to have doubled in the space of a single conversation. The months that followed brought changes to the ranch as Brody prepared for the coming baby with characteristic thoroughness. He expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a small nursery. A rocking chair appeared by the fireplace, a surprise he'd commissioned from a carpenter in town. The root cellar was stocked with enough preserved food to last through the harshest winter, and extra firewood was stacked higher than the cabin windows. Violet's body changed too, her slender frame softening as the baby grew within her. Brody watched these changes with a reverence that made her feel beautiful even as she grew awkward and ungainly. His hand sought out the curve of her belly in quiet moments, his expression one of wonder when he felt the first fluttering kicks of their child. Winter arrived with a vengeance in early December, blanketing the ranch in snow and confining them largely to the cabin. Violet, now showing prominently in her 6th month, found the enforced rest not entirely unwelcome. She used the time to sew baby clothes and quilts, to read from the books Brody brought back from his infrequent trips to town, and to enjoy the quiet intimacy of their life together. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after a simple but festive supper, Brody presented her with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Violet asked, surprised. They had agreed to keep the holiday simple with handmade gifts only. "Open it," Brody urged, an unusual nervousness in his manner. Violet unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she found blank pages filled with Brody's surprisingly neat handwriting. "It's our story," he explained as she leafed through the first few pages. "From the night we met until now, I thought our child should know how their parents found each other, how close we came to never meeting at all." Tears welled in Violet's eyes as she read passages describing their first encounter, the storm, her illness, their wedding day. Brody's straightforward prose captured the essence of their journey with a simplicity that was deeply moving. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing her fingers over his words. "The most thoughtful gift I've ever received." "There's plenty of blank pages left," Brody said, a smile softening his features. "We'll keep adding to it as we go." Violet leaned across to kiss him, pouring all her love into the gesture. "Thank you for remembering everything. How could I forget a moment of it?" He replied, his hand coming to rest on the swell of her belly where their child moved restlessly. "Every day with you has been worth remembering." The winter deepened, bringing blizzards that isolated them completely for days at a time. Brody grew increasingly anxious as Violet's due date approached, conscious of their distance from the nearest doctor. He arranged for Martha Henderson, an experienced midwife who had delivered most of the children in the area, to stay with them for the last 2 weeks of Violet's confinement. The baby, however, had plans of its own. On a crystal-clear February morning, with the temperature well below freezing and Mrs. Henderson still at her own ranch 5 miles away, Violet's labor began. "It's too early," Brody said, panic evident in his voice as he helped her to the bed. "The baby's not due for another week." "Babies come when they're ready," Violet replied through gritted teeth as another contraction gripped her. "And this one is ready now." "I'll ride for Mrs. Henderson," Brody decided, already reaching for his coat. "No," Violet said firmly, grasping his hand. "There's no time and I need you here. We can do this, Brody. Women have been having babies without doctors since the beginning of time." The fear in his eyes nearly broke her heart. "Violet, I don't know the first thing about delivering a baby." "Neither do I," she admitted with a strained laugh. "But we'll figure it out together, like everything else." The labor progressed rapidly, giving them little choice in the matter. Brody proved himself equal to the challenge, his initial terror giving way to a focused calm as he followed Violet's instinctive directions. He boiled water, gathered clean linens, and supported her through increasingly powerful contractions with steady hands and encouraging words. As the winter sun reached its zenith, casting brilliant light through the cabin windows, Benjamin Thomas Keller announced his arrival with a lusty cry that brought tears of relief and joy to both his parents' eyes. "He's perfect," Brody whispered in awe as he placed the swaddled infant in Violet's arms. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a set of lungs that would put a mountain lion to shame. Violet laughed weakly, exhaustion and elation mingling as she gazed down at their son's tiny face. "He has your chin," she observed, tracing a gentle finger over the baby's features. "And your eyes, I think," Brody replied, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, his arm supporting both his wife and newborn son. "We did it," Violet said softly, leaning against his shoulder. "Just the 2 of us." "3 of us now," Brody corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "A family." In that moment, with the winter sun streaming through the windows and their newborn son cradled between them, Violet felt the full circle of their journey. From a frightened, rain-soaked woman with nothing left to lose, to a wife and mother surrounded by love and security, the transformation seemed nothing short of miraculous. Yet it wasn't miracle that had brought them here, but a series of choices. Brody's decision to stop that stormy night, her courage in accepting his help, their mutual willingness to take a chance on love despite the odds. Together, they had built this life, this family, this future full of promise. As Benjamin drifted to sleep in her arms, Violet looked up at her husband's face, weathered now not just by sun and wind, but by shared joys and struggles, by love freely given and gratefully received. "I love you, Brody Keller," she said simply. "More than I ever thought possible." His answering smile was as warm as the day they'd met was cold, as steady as his promises had proven to be. "And I love you, Violet Keller, forever, just like I promised that first night." Outside, the Montana winter continued its reign, but within the cabin's walls, spring had already arrived in the form of new life and renewed commitment. Whatever challenges the years ahead might bring, they would face them as they had faced everything else together, with the love that had begun on a stormy night and grown into a bond as vast and enduring as the Montana sky above them. 5 years later, On a warm June evening in 1882, Violet Keller stood in the doorway of their expanded ranch house, watching as Brody taught their son Benjamin to ride his very first pony. The little boy's laughter carried across the yard, mingling with the happy squeals of 3-year-old Margaret as she chased a butterfly nearby, her dark curls bouncing with each determined step. The ranch had prospered beyond their early hopes. What had once been a modest cabin was now a comfortable home with proper glass windows, a covered porch, and rooms enough for their growing family. The herd had tripled in size, and last year they'd hired 2 permanent hands to help with the expanding operation. A letter had arrived that morning from Billings. Violet's aunt had finally been located, alive and well, running a millinery shop. She was planning to visit them next month, eager to meet the niece she'd last seen as a child, and the family Violet had created here in the heart of Montana. Life wasn't without its hardships. The winter of '79 had been brutal, taking nearly a quarter of their herd. Benjamin had suffered a dangerous fever his second year that had left them sleepless for days. And last summer's drought had tested their resources to the limit. But they had weathered each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with every obstacle overcome. Brody looked up from his patient instruction, catching Violet's eye across the yard. The smile he sent her way still had the power to quicken her pulse, a mixture of love, pride, and an intimacy born of years sharing work, dreams, and a bed. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet around them, they sat together on the porch swing Brody had built as an anniversary gift the previous year. The stars spread across the Montana sky in a glittering tapestry, more brilliant than any city dweller could imagine. "Penny for your thoughts," Brody said, his arm warm around her shoulders. Violet leaned into his embrace, content in a way she'd never dreamed possible before that stormy night so many years ago. "I was just thinking about promises kept," she replied softly. About a frightened girl who begged a stranger not to leave her alone, and the man who promised her forever instead. Brody's arm tightened around her. "Best promise I ever made," he said, his voice rich with sincerity. "And the easiest to keep." As they rocked gently in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the home they'd built together, Violet knew with absolute certainty that some storms were blessings in disguise, driving us not into danger, but into the very arms where we were always meant to be.